Today I'm extremely excited because I have with me the Honourable Dr. Palanivel Thiaga Rajan, who's Tamil Nadu's Finance Minister, who is here visiting us in Melbourne and will be telling us what makes Tamil Nadu India's investment hub. So welcome, Minister. It's fantastic to have you here. For those that don't know, Tamil Nadu, of course, is a state in the southern part of India. It is the country's second largest economy, third largest exporting state, and currently contributes nearly 9% of India's net exports. And over the years, it has attracted tremendous investment and emerged as the #1 investment destination in the first 9 months of the financial year of 2022. No doubt, Minister, to some of your own efforts in that sense. It's also a state which is the leader of renewable energy. And we'll delve into a bit of that today as well. I think the list of Tamil Nadu as a state's achievements goes on, and no doubt with a concerted effort from the Tamil Nadu government. I had the privilege of visiting Tamil Nadu during April this year, and I must say, Minister, I was hugely impressed. In my few days there in Chennai, I visited some excellent education institutions. I visited IIT Madras, University of Madras. I even went to the Roja Muthia Library and learnt about the life and contribution of Roja Muthia. It was very inspiring. And I also had the privilege of meeting the IT Secretary of Madras, Neeraj Mittal, who shared with me some great achievements of the state. And I witnessed, of course, the cosmopolitan culture of Chennai that it has to offer deeply rooted in Indian traditions and values, and I do hope to visit again soon and meet you there as well. So I want to congratulate you first, Minister, on the state's tremendous performance as the #1 destination in India, and welcome you here to the University of Melbourne and also to Melbourne, which I understand may be your second visit here. And I wanted to just start by asking you, other than the cold weather, how have you found Melbourne?
Yeah, it's a beautiful city. I think it has its own unique culture, and that's always interesting and enlightening to see how cultures develop, how people come together, and every place is unique. Some places stand out more than others, and so Melbourne, of course, has a very unique character. And I've only been here, as you say, twice, once for 24 hours as a banker, and this time for 48 hours as a minister. So though it's too brief, it gives you a flavor, and of course it's a wonderful campus. So I'm so happy to be here.
We're so pleased that you came, even though it is a short 2-day trip. I think you're getting a taste of the cosmopolitan side of Melbourne and how that pretty much matches a lot of the cosmopolitan side of Chennai.
Yeah.
And you've also spent time with the Australia-India Youth Dialogue, and they're incredible delegates. I had the opportunity to also meet them as well. How have you found that?
Actually, I spent only one evening, but with I think the previous cohorts. It wasn't the actual event, but it was in the emerging leaders.
Yes.
It was fascinating because, it was people who have some experience, who've already done a lot of things in their life, who have in many ways broken new paths. And so it was a very interesting dialogue. It was a bit surreal because I'd just flown in from the UK, and so it was close to midnight when it ended. But it was a lot of fun and enlightening for me, and I hope of some value to the delegates. Yeah.
Yes, I've been watching from some of your Twitter feed your trips to the UK and the US, and certainly really impactful for you as a minister, being able to talk about some of the activities and reforms that you're doing as a minister. And I'm sure you must be feeling slightly jet lagged right now. So thank you for spending time with us here at the university. But I'd like to sort of delve a little bit into that. I mean, in terms of Tamil Nadu, firstly, we know that the central government, the Modi government, has, aiming to make India a $5 trillion economy by 2026. No small feat in that. But we've also heard that Tamil Nadu's government has expressed big ambitions for the state, hoping to make it a $1 trillion economy by 2030, which equates to a roughly 1/5 of India's total economy. I know that you were talking about this with Lord Ahmed in the UK. Very ambitious goal, but what were some of the outcomes from that discussion, or how was that perceived by the UK? How are you seeing that in terms of the Tamil Nadu government? Are you on track to meet this target?
I must first say that all these are nominal statistics, right? So in that day's money, yes. And so the difference between 2026 and 2030 can be actually quite large, because if you take real growth adjusted for inflation, India, if it is administered properly, should grow between 8 and 10%. Then you add in inflation, in the age that we're in, we're probably in a higher inflation age than we were the last 15 years or so. So let's even say conservatively 6%. So you add 8 and 6 and you're looking at 14, 15%, between 8 and 10 and 6 and 7. So 15% compounded for 4 years is a big number.
Yes.
So I'm not sure our ambition is to be 20% of India, but we're probably already 10.5, 11% of India. And if we achieve our target, we'll probably be more like 15, 16. But our target is unique to us and set by our Chief Minister. And the target is, it calls for roughly 14% of, or thereabouts, nominal growth, including inflation. I'm happy to say we hit that the first year in office, and we're on track the next 2 years. But, at some level, there are many macro variables outside our control that will affect this. But we have a couple of advantages. One, we're coming out of COVID and coming out of, though Tamil Nadu never went into recession. India went into recession, pretty deep recession, minus 7.6% growth, but we were about plus 1.5%. So that's still low.
Why do you think that was? Why did Tamil Nadu sort of survive that pandemic, recession?
I think two things. One, always either good events like deregulation and opening up of trade and so forth, or bad events like recessions or crises always exacerbate inequality, right? Some people are better poised to ride out the storm. It's just true of nature. In our case, we did something more than that, which is that we actually stimulated demand quite a bit. It was our campaign promise the Chief Minister made. And so we did almost $2 billion, which is big by our size. Our budget is only about $30 billion or so last year. So we did about $2 billion, of additional stimulus. And I think that helped us a bit make sure that people consumed. We had otherwise a resilient economy in many ways. I can give you some statistics, but the approach to keeping the bottom of the pyramid kind of elevated during difficult times, I would say, was one of the variables. The other is that we, as I say, structurally, we were better poised to ride out the crisis. Mm-hmm. And so, I think those factors combined to do that. So my point is, though, that even coming off that gives us an advantage. And so we think we're on track to get to 1 trillion in 10 years. We're already about 320 billion last year, so we still got a ways to go. But we have a more concrete plan being developed. I've announced in the budget this year that we're going to set up a kind of outside consultant, like our predecessor did, including global agencies like the World Bank or IMF or the ADB or the AIIB to help us get more concrete. What sectors? What periods of time, what growth rate can we expect given what we think will be the macroeconomic trend? For example, now we benefit from the diversification away from China. Yeah. Right, in a big way. Many countries are trying to broaden their reliance on outside suppliers in the logistics supply chain. So in that sense, we have many tailwinds, but those won't last 10 years. Yeah. So we've got to have a more concrete plan. We're in the process of developing that.
Well, those structural reforms are clearly, ensuring that Tamil Nadu is set up for the long term. And I think when you talk about the diversification of supply chains, that's a huge focus now in Australia, and very much part of our pivot to India. Of course, we recently signed an interim free trade agreement with the Indian government, and looking forward to that progressing into a full free trade agreement. And there are so many opportunities that I witnessed during my time in April in India at the state levels, where states are just already doing so much. And I think Tamil Nadu is certainly the leader in that space. But of course, there's competition a bit between the states in India as well. And I think looking at the tech sector, for example, or even maybe the renewable sector, I mean, Tamil Nadu is incredible in its renewable footprint. Surely that's not just happened, other than it being obviously a good place weather-wise.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is natural advantages, as you say, a lot of wind. We're at the tip of the peninsula, so we have the monsoon winds and the seasonal winds. We also have high insolation levels, so we're good at solar. We're now looking at offshore wind, which is the big emerging technology, and a little down the line, wave energy. We have a large coastline. So some of it is just the benefit of being in the right place. Some of it is conscious strategy and conscious policy. And one of the things that has been a hallmark of Tamil Nadu, actually going back 100 years before it was called Tamil Nadu, it was called Madras State. Mm-hmm. And before that, it was part of what the British administered as the Madras Presidency. And ever since the partial devolution of power in 1920, under what was then called the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, we've had remarkable consistency in policy. So though many parties have come and gone, and especially in the last 40 years or so, almost every 5 years a new party came to power. It went between the two major parties. Some things stayed the same. The focus on education, the focus on inclusion, the focus on women's rights and empowerment, the focus on providing opportunities for all communities, because we come from a society that's a couple thousand years old, a culture where there was some bad aspects of it. There was a stratification of the caste system, and hierarchy. So to break the bounds of all of those, we've had consistency in policy. Mm-hmm. And in fact, for those who can read about it a bit, there was only about 30 years or so that the state, as we know it now, was not administered by all parties that adhere to the same philosophy that we call the Dravidian philosophy or the Dravidian Model.
And I was going to ask you about the Dravidian model, because it's clearly unique in India. And as you say, politics aside, it just continues and creates that sort of value set for Tamil Nadu to have really good outcomes for women's rights and for equality for all. I find that very refreshing, that things don't sort of break down over politics. If you look here in Australia, one of the things our new Prime Minister, who's only recently been elected, Prime Minister Albanese, has said is we want to put an end to the climate wars. Yeah. That has been a real political football here in Australia for too long. Whereas in Tamil Nadu, you have that consistency based on, as you say, the values that last throughout politics. So
I think there's two ways of looking at that. One, I think, is that as I was saying, except for 30 years, it was administered by people who professed the same values. So it wasn't that big a deal. Politics was not about left or right or policy differences. It was mostly about personality issues. In fact, good or bad, that's what it was. But even those 30 years when the Congress party then ruled Madras Presidency and some time Madras State, the Congress of Tamil Nadu and Madras adhered much closer to the Dravidian philosophy than to the Congress of the rest of India. For example, the Dravidian parties nationalized the kings and historic temples to ensure preservation of the culture and equal access to all castes, because in the old system, certain people are not allowed into the... And the Congress not only did not reverse that when they came to power, they doubled down and they said, Dalit Temple Entry Act was enforced by the Congress in the 1930s. In education, the compulsory elementary education of boys and girls was legislated in 1921. When the Congress came to power, they doubled down on that and said, we expand the free meal scheme to all children in all schools, who meet the income criteria. So that was the history and the continuity. The flip side of that, I think, is that results matter, right? If you have a philosophy and it produces good results, it's easier for others to adhere to that and not change it. Mm-hmm. When you have things that are failing, everybody wants to come and fix it. Mm-hmm. But if you continue to show better and better relative to, the Indian average, or at an absolute level in terms of per capita income or social development indicators or human development indicators, and, then why would you change it? So I think that is the fundamental difference between the Dravidian model and many of the other ones, including the kind of Hindutva model that is now in vogue in a lot of the BJP states and attempted at the union, is that they have not been able to produce results. My philosophy is, okay, it's the basis and the motivation for me to be in politics. But if year after year after year the results come poorly, surely I should start questioning whether I'm on the right track. And if decade after decade, the results come well, surely I must double up my commitment to certain values and to certain systems. Now, one could argue that the cause and effect relationship in many things in life is not very clear. But in this case, it is 100% crystal clear, because we've had such an advantage for so long that it's a no-brainer that it's really about empowering women, about inclusion, about giving all sections of society and a path and access opportunity. And if you do that, you get much better outcomes. And if you don't do that, you get not so good outcomes. So, that's beyond debate, I think, at this point.
Yeah. Well, it's refreshing, it's exciting to hear you talk about that, and to talk about the uniqueness of Tamil Nadu and what it produces in that sense. So just looking at your finance ministry, you've got, again, some, bold reforms that you want to make in your ministry over the next couple of years, and driving investment, of course, is part of that. You've got an ambitious plan, but I'm sure I know you're the right person for the job. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think I probably would look at it at three levels. The first is that the fiscal kind of position of the state in terms of the deficits, the debt to GDP ratio, the interest to revenue ratio, which had been improving phenomenally from 2003, 2004, which was the year that both the union level and most of the states passed the Fiscal Responsibility Acts, what they call the FRBM, Financial Responsibility and Management of Budget Act in Delhi, and the equivalents around the state, which said you shall not have revenue deficits and you should limit your fiscal deficit to 3% of GDP, and had some other criteria. You should have a medium-term plan, etc. But these were the two big benchmarks. And between 2003 and 2014, Tamil Nadu consistently met or came very close to meeting those benchmarks. And the statistics improved dramatically. The debt to GDP ratio came down from 27-28% down to 16-17. The interest to revenue ratio came down from 20-21 down to 10-11. And then, of course, things started to get a bit haywire, because the lady who was otherwise elected first was incapacitated and then she died. Yes. And so, people who had been not directly mandated by the voters were afraid of really making any reform or executing the plan she left behind. And so the fisc deteriorated dramatically. And we went back in 6 or 7 years to as bad as we'd been, 25 or 18 years ago. And we're back to like 27-28% debt to GDP, and we're back to 20-21% interest to revenue. So the first job was to fix that. And when I came, I thought it would take us 5 years, but now I'm very comfortable that we can do it in 3 years, because in the first year we were able to reduce the fiscal deficit by over 1%, from 461 down to about 350. And we are able to get control of the system in other ways. So as a former banker and administrator of large banking operations globally, I now have enough understanding of the system to know that this can be done.
Your banking background must be so useful for a finance minister, very much so.
But the second ambition I've said is that in 2 years, I want to build the best and most professional and kind of technology platform supported finance ministry in the history of India, which is not that hard because there's not been that many before. But a small portion of what I would have seen in a large global bank, to have real-time data, to have dashboards, to have institutional memory, continuity, checks and balances. And that includes, for example, I've, announced a new post like Director General of Audit, beef up the internal audit. As you know, we also follow the British parliamentary system. If you wait for things to go to the external auditor, which is the CAG, then by the time those get resolved, it takes 10 times the effort. They have to be placed in the House, all the members have to get it, has to go to a Public Accounts Committee, they have to. So if you can quell this before it goes to that, not only is it good governance, it's also efficiency.
Absolutely.
So my second ambition was that I would create this kind of platform and the most kind of professional infrastructure. I've done that at other places, so I'm fairly comfortable I can do that. But my third ambition really is to change the culture of the place. And that's always the hardest to do.
I was going to say, that's the hard one.
And so, in some ways I've been fortunate because many of the senior bureaucrats in my department have never served in finance before. So they don't really have a bad kind of scare, bad practices to break. So, we'll see how it goes, but I'm fairly confident that we can fix the fisc in 2 years. We can certainly put in much more sophisticated systems than we've ever had. After all, India is a leading technology provider to the world, right?
Absolutely.
And then we'll see how the culture change goes. Yeah.
Well, look, I think that is an ambitious plan that I can see you executing because, as soon as you talk about technology, I mean, that was my experience of visiting some of the states, southern states in India, is the technology footprint in these states is just going through the roof. And Tamil Nadu is certainly a part of that, particularly if we look into, well, you talked about fintech, but I mean, looking more broadly into clean tech, looking into sort of all sorts of software developments. But in the clean tech space, EVs, I know, a part of your sort of ambition and plan as well. So what makes Tamil Nadu so good as a state to go down into that clean tech space?
Well, I would say partly the economic circumstances, right? We're at double the national per capita GDP or income. It's about $4,000 a year, which is slowly reaching middle income kind of status. We have an average education of about high school graduate, and almost 52% of our college age children enroll in college. And it may be too high.
So you're producing all the talent.
Yeah. So we have the right level of, and therefore they are aspirational. And therefore we have to plan for those kinds of expectations. We are not just now about sustenance or providing the basic needs. We now have a society that's, and as you know, the Tamil diaspora is not only quite large, but is disproportionately well represented in kind of the top CEOs and, in banking, in technology, in many parts of the world. There's a huge Tamil. Tamils are about 6% or 7% of the population of India. If you take the top tiers of global companies, they're probably 30% of all Indians.
Very overrepresented, right?
By 5x.
It's incredible.
So that helps us because it sets the path down, is that, people have those kinds of aspirations, those kinds of, what can I say, forefathers, and they want to reach that level of output. And so we have to drive for that. And that means being leaders in clean energy, being leaders in automation, innovation, in, global connect, if you will. So, for example, our Prime Minister has announced that India wants to be carbon neutral by 2050. And so the point I've been making is if India is going to get there by 2050, Tamil Nadu has to get there by 2035 or 2040 because we are that much ahead of the Indian average in all other aspects, and we are still the number one renewable energy state. So partly better storage technology, partly emerging technologies like offshore wind and wave, partly better storage, not just in lithium or other batteries, but in other ways of storage like pumped hydro storage or geothermal, stuff like that. So I think there's a potential to get there in time relative to the Indian goal. Yeah.
And these are ways that both our countries can work so closely together in terms of decarbonising both of our economies because, we've all signed up to these targets to reach that. I want to talk about one of the challenges though, because clearly, Tamil Nadu is actively promoting information technology in the state, and you've got this, objective to become the ICT hub of South Asia. creating that real knowledge-driven ecosystem that's required. And as I said, I went to IIT Madras, and you've got some incredible educational institutions to provide the sorts of graduates needed to achieve that. But something I also experienced is the challenge that there really isn't enough talent coming through the educational system, be it here in Australia or in India, to meet the demand of the tech sector. Yeah. This is an ongoing problem for both of our countries. How are we going to meet this challenge?
In India, or maybe not even India, in Tamil Nadu, we have a bit of a unique problem, in the sense that we certainly have the demographic dividend, we certainly have the number of people that we need or more. The problem is the quality of education is not uniform, and in many cases inadequate, frankly. And the match between what the economy needs and what the system produces is not there. I've lived in other parts of the world, and in particular in the US, it's a brilliant connectivity between the education system and the real economy. And so institutions adjust and ensure that what they're producing is what the economy demands. There's a lot of funding that goes from industry. There's internship programs, there's fellowships, there's research projects. There's, a lot of universities get funded from the economy, not from the government. And so the connectivity is there, and the adjustment and the fine-tuning happens continuously all the time. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there are, broader kind of data systems like the Bureau of Labor Statistics that tell you what's there, and the commerce departments that tell you what the projection is. And then people can read these and adjust their career choices to what the demand is going to be. In India, we have none of that. Right. In Tamil Nadu, we're just about starting. So it is one of the Chief Minister's kind of pet projects that we bring this professionalism, skilling, and starting young on the new cohort, starting with much better career counseling and guidance at the schools, at the government schools, not just for the students, but for their parents. Because you see, what we have is this kind of explosive growth. When I graduated engineering college in 1987, the state of Tamil Nadu produced about 3,500 to 4,000 engineers. Now, for almost 35 years later, it produces 150,000. Oh. And so, both in terms of professors to teach them, but more importantly, with so many first-generation graduates and first-generation high school graduates, their parents are ill-equipped to guide them in career choices and kind of going forward. And the economy has become much more diversified. It didn't used to be. So now we want to focus a lot on educating first-generation students and their parents about what the economy needs, what kinds of compensation models and expectations of future growth will you have, and what is the kind of professionalism required to compete, not just at a national level, but at a global level in these things. It's not just enough to get good marks. You have to have all these other characteristics about perseverance, about punctuality, about, discipline, about all these things. So it's a huge effort, but we are, again, partnering up with people. For example, we're signing with Germany, which has a very unique apprenticeship and skill development program, model, shall I say, for their country. And we want to try and bring some of that. We're talking to other places that can bring, with the UK, we're talking about, with the British Council, much more, though we have more English speakers than most, they're not necessarily of the global quality in some cases. So we're going to fix it. So I think it's a question of matching the output of the educational and skill development system to what the economy needs. This is changing all the time. So you have to be able to keep kind of forecasting and predicting this. Mm-hmm. And then you have to adapt this to that. And we've not been doing either, frankly. So we don't yet have a problem where we don't have enough human beings. We don't have people with the right skill. Yeah. So we're trying to fix that.
Mm. Well, I would love to see, some more mobility between both of our countries in this space, because we have a number of Indian ICT companies right here in Melbourne, like Infosys, Wipro, TCS in Sydney, and of course we also have Australian tech companies like Atlassian who are in Bangalore and want to expand into other states, so including Tamil Nadu. So I think there's lots of scope for growth for both of our countries on this issue, because we're both facing the same challenge of not enough.
Well, it's slightly different, I think, in the sense that here it's a very small and shrinking population because you've reached that level of economic activity. There, it's that we don't have the right people learning and doing the right things. So it's the same net effect, but for different causes. And therefore, I think, in a way, we might be complementary, because I think if we can fix our problem, we can actually help solve your problem in that sense. Yeah.
Well, at the Institute, we hope to play a role in helping tell a little bit about the India-Australia tech story, because it's certainly one that is growing. We all know about the US-India tech story, but we also have our own companies here, Indian companies, Australian companies. So it'd be great to sort of build on that and ensure we have more sort of problem solving that we're talking about today. So at the Institute, we're hosting a leadership dialogue in September in India, where we will explore this a lot further. I did want to just ask you, Minister, a little bit about, last November when you launched your fintech policy. It was obviously aimed at making Tamil Nadu a global fintech hub. You talked a little bit about your reforms in that space. But when we talk about fintech and its importance, how important is that in terms of you achieving some of these reforms you want to achieve? And, do you see any sort of challenges along that journey in terms of the bureaucracy, or in terms of, as you say, those not experienced to the change that you're trying to implement?
Yeah, I would say far beyond the government itself, and far beyond our state itself. One of the reasons we wanted to be the fintech hub is that, as of today, though Karnataka and Bangalore are in some ways a different scale, and certainly in unicorns and startups and the ecosystem than Chennai. In the financial services industry, Chennai stands head and shoulders above everybody else. So all the way from, trust and custody banks like Bank of New York, through commercial banks, through investment banks, through asset managers, to, my own former employer, Standard Chartered Bank, has probably 10,000 plus employees in Chennai, all the way to hedge funds, like D.E. Shaw. Chennai has probably the predominant kind of financial services global capability centers. And we still think there's room to move up the value chain on those centers. And as the emerging technology comes, and as we move from kind of more mundane processing to, what fintech really does is it increases reliability, integrity of the data, and reduces the operational risk in the system compared to a traditional approach to technology support of financial services. So we think we're poised to kind of take advantage of that. And that was one of the reasons, for example, to my recent trip to New York, where I ran into some old friends and some new friends about, moving up already large operations in Tamil Nadu and using the new incentives we've offered, where we've offered land in a prime urban location and to set up a fintech city to provide support and subsidies to help them choose this to be the new hub. So that's probably a separate ecosystem. Most of the reforms I'm doing in my department are probably still a couple of steps away from that level of sophistication. We're still doing the basics, unfortunately. So maybe in a couple of years I'll have a different view. Yeah.
Well, I would love to follow up with you in a couple of years and see how Tamil Nadu is progressing in terms of these reforms. It's clearly a very exciting agenda that you have as a minister, making a difference every day for the people of Tamil Nadu and indeed for India as a whole. And we hope that we can have you back here at the University of Melbourne for a longer time next time, and also at the Australia-India Institute. But in the meantime, hopefully I get to come visit you in Tamil Nadu very soon.
Please do that. First, let me thank you again for this wonderful opportunity, for the time, for the tour, for the meetings. And I look forward very much to continuing the interaction and to welcoming you in India soon. Yeah.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.